All right, so I am going to talk about Buddhism. And so, what I'll do is talk about the founding legend of Buddhism, and then what's called the four passing sites, which are part of that founding legend, and then a few things about the features of Buddhism, and then the Four Noble Truths, which are at the spine of Buddhism, and then a couple of Buddhist concepts. So, beginning with the founding legend of Buddhism, the original story. The story of Buddhism begins with a young, sheltered noble boy whose father has sheltered him from all the harshness of the world. Okay, and his name was Siddhartha Gautama, and lived about the 6th century BCE, before Common Era. And so once he was able to get beyond his father's walls, and he witnessed what I called the four passing sights. Okay, so what are the four things he saw? Well, first he saw an old man, and from this he learned about aging, the fact that everything essentially ages and decays. And this was further reinforced when he saw a body racked with disease, and so he learned about disease, okay, and the suffering that comes with it. He also saw a corpse, okay, which brought home to him the issue of death. Excuse me. And then he saw a monk from whom he also learned the idea of the path of renunciation. So, in seeing these things, especially the first three, he learns that pain is inevitable in life and fleshly pleasures all lost their charm for him. And so he was interested in this path of renunciation. Now, he joined a band of ascetics, and so this word asceticism, this really refers to a life of discipline and deprivation. Okay, and so an ascetic is someone who lives the ascetic life. So usually they live a life where they give up just things, maybe a life of hardship, a life of extreme discipline. They might decide to be celibate to give up sex, or decide to fast often to give up foods, just basically to restrict the life and discipline their lives to achieve spiritual enlightenment. You find ascetics in many religions. So usually religions with monks and nuns are religions. These are religions that have the ascetic life. These are examples of the ascetic life. So he joined a band of ascetics and eventually found out it was not for him. He actually got very, very ill. And so he decided that the best way to achieve enlightenment and the best path to follow was a sort of a middle way between indulgence and asceticism. Right? So, on the one hand, don't indulge all your bodily lusts or desires. On the other hand, there's no reason to deprive yourself so much that it becomes an impediment. So eventually, he did achieve enlightenment, and he becomes the Buddha, the awakened one. He became enlightened. And so he started a new movement, and this new movement is what became known as Buddhism. It's interesting to and important to realize that the dominant religion at the time for him was Hinduism. So that's what you want to keep in mind. That Buddhism, to a very large extent, is a reaction uh, to Hinduism as was practiced in his time in his general region. Okay, so this new movement that he begins So this new Buddhist movement. There are a few features of this movement. So he preached a religion that was devoid of authority and hierarchy. Okay, so as opposed to the Brahmin culture in Hinduism, where you had a certain caste of priests who were at the top of the spiritual food chain, so to speak. He preached a religion that was devoid of ritual. So, of course, in Hinduism, there are hundreds of rituals, and many of them very, very old. And of course, these rituals can, for the most part, only be performed by the priests. He preached a religion that was devoid of speculation. All right, so in most religions, most religions develop a theology or a philosophy, and Hinduism is no different. And that's when you begin to think about what's beyond what you can actually feel or experience. And your theology gets speculative. So you believe that there is a God or a divine, and then you begin to think of the characteristics of this divine, and you can build a very speculative theology that's based on your faith. Now he wanted to move away from that, so he established a movement that was that avoided speculation. So let's not say devoid, let's just say avoided. So it avoided speculation. And then he wanted a religion that was devoid and unburdened by previous traditions. All right, so every religion essentially it has to be a religion of tradition, but he felt just the weight of the previous traditions, for instance, having hierarchies, rituals, theological speculation, philosophies, these things were getting in the way of enlightenment. And so his movement that he began wanted to move away from all these previous traditions. And then he preached a religion that was going to be a religion of self-effort, okay, as opposed to a religion of grace. So what we mean by religion of grace is where one relies on the divine, right? So for him, if you want to achieve enlightenment, you want to achieve nirvana, you can't wait for the divine to do that for you. You have to work towards that goal. Okay, so this was his goal, to preach this type of religion that relied in which one relied more on self-effort than, say, grace. That's waiting for the divine to aid you in your journey towards enlightenment. So there are a few certain features of Buddhism, okay, that result from this new movement. I mean, his original vision. Okay, so Buddhism is empirical and scientific. And what we mean that here is just really a mindset that it is based more on experience and evidence. Okay, so if you think of the scientific process is really more about a method of working with evidence, right, to reach a certain conclusion. And when you speak of something that's empirical, you're speaking about things that you can actually touch, you can see, you can taste, you can experience. Okay, so this was a religion. He wanted to be one that was empirical and scientific, at least in its practice. Okay, it was a religion that was pragmatic. And pragmatic just means practical. Right? So you want a religion that people can actually do, right? Where things are achievable. All right? He wanted a religion that was therapeutic. So that means he wanted to cure suffering. Okay, so if you recall the four passing sights, three of them have to do with the idea that just this suffering in the world. Okay, and so he wanted religion that sought in some way to fight this suffering. Um, and now this another feature of Buddhism is that it is psychological. Okay, as opposed to metaphysical. So metaphysical has to do with speculative philosophy. So we talked about the idea of avoiding speculation, right? So when you say you want a religion that's, if you talk about a religion that's psychological, that means the focus is more about you analyzing your own mind and what's present to you, right? Metaphysics determines on is more about logic and speculative projection. So you begin to make speculative claims about what you can't see, what's beyond nature. And so every religion has its own metaphysics. What do you believe is beyond what you can see and hear? Now, he wanted to avoid all of that. So simply, you find in Buddhism that the focus, his vision was that it was going to be more psychological. You focus on what exactly you can experience. Excuse me. Now, he wanted, another feature, at least according to his vision, was that Buddhism would be egalitarian. See if I can spell that right. Essentially, things would be equal. So a feature of Buddhism, as you've seen, is that you have the caste system, you have different levels, and people aren't all equal. Okay, in Buddhism, that's not the case. At least that is in his original vision. Okay, and then also it was very much individual focused. It was directed towards individuals. Okay, so these are certain features of Buddhism, at least in the original vision of Buddhism. Another thing I should note here is that Buddhism is essentially atheistic. So there is no God like you'd find in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or in many native religions, or in Hinduism. It's an atheistic religion. All right, so central to Buddhism are what's called the Four Noble Truths. Okay, so the first one is that life is suffering. So this is not really meant to be, um, a sort of pessimistic view of life. It's actually meant to be just an honest look of life. And essentially, once you're born, you're in that treadmill or escalator towards your death, right? And seeing the old man, right, one of the four passing sights, you just learn that what life is. I mean, I mean, you grow, but also you're decaying. You're fighting against its forces. So that's just the essence of life. Life is suffering. Okay. Um, the other thing we see then is the second noble truth is that the cause of suffering is desire. Okay, so one reason why we suffer in life is because of our attachment, our desire for things. Okay, and so to overcome our desire, we have to liberate ourselves from attachment. Okay, so liberate from attachment. And the way to do that is to use the eightfold path. Okay, and Houston Smith speaks about the eightfold path. So I'm not going to talk about those in detail. All right, now I'm going to talk about a couple of concepts in Buddhism, the idea of the notion of divinity, or what the actual goal is in Buddhism, and how Buddhism sees the human self. So, nirvana is the word that the Buddha used to name life's goal. Okay, so it's the state in which all the bundles of private desires have been consumed, and everything that restricts the boundless life is exhausted, right? So all your desires for all these little things that are somewhat inconsequential in this life are sort of burned away, right? And you've exhausted all this, gotten rid of all those things. Now, nirvana is not a personal God. Okay, so it's not a personal God like you have in Judaism or Christianity or Islam. Okay, again, Buddhism is atheistic. Now, nirvana can mean Godhead. That's another way of saying, divinity. And when we think of nirvana, we have to think of it in its it's permanent. So the number of adjectives here that Houston Smith uses: it's stable, it's imperishable, it's ageless, it's deathless, right? Doesn't die, it doesn't extinguish, it's unborn, right? So it doesn't come into being, and it doesn't change. So it's very similar to the concept of being that you find in many philosophies and theologies. Okay, it is also power. Okay, it's bliss. It's happiness. So this is really what it is that we want, right? Ultimately, we want this full experience of just being part of the most excellent thing that we can imagine, and this is it, right? Something that's there permanently. It's a happiness I'll never leave. It's permanent, it's ageless, and we want to be part of this. So nirvana is the real truth, it's the supreme reality, it is the good. So I do that with a capital G. It's a supreme goal, right? And it's the one and only consummation of our lives. It's eternal, it's hidden, it's incomprehensible peace. So this is really what we want, we design. This is the life's goal. Now, let me just shrink this and move this to the side. All right, another concept in Buddhism is has to do with the human self. So let's just talk about this briefly. So in Buddhism, there is no soul, as in a spiritual substance that keeps its identity forever. Okay, so if you think of, say, a religion like Islam or Christianity, when you die, you retain your identity as who you are, right? And then you get judged. Okay, Buddhism doesn't have a soul in that sense. Now, the Buddha did not doubt reincarnation, right? So he's fine with reincarnation, but he sees it differently than, say, in Hinduism. So if you recall, in Hinduism, you have the jivas which appear mysteriously, and then get on this wheel of this karma run wheel of, birth, death, and rebirth, and keep going through successive life stages. So if you recall that, I have a diagram like this, and you just keep going up and up. Eventually, you get to you achieve moksha, which is this liberation from this cycle. Um, the Buddha did not see this reincarnation in this sense, so he didn't see it as a psychic pellet, right, that migrates from body to body. Right? So it's not this, that goes from one body to the next to the next. That's more of a Hindu version of reincarnation. Rather, he viewed reincarnation as a wave. Okay, so if you think about a wave on the ocean, so let's say like this, let's say this is the shore. So if you think about, so this is the same wave, right? But the components of the wave differ as you proceed, right? So, excuse me. So for instance, the droplets of water that make up this wave probably come in and crash, and then you have different droplets of water that sort of make up this wave. Now some of them may continue, but you get other things that sort of join in, right? So these are all the different droplets here. Some move in different directions. Some continue, but others join here, right? And then these ones, maybe some of them crash out, and you get some more joining. So it's the same wave, but it's constituted, by various different strands. So this is his view of reincarnation. It's not as though you have a single entity that's moving, right? Rather, you have these different strands of of the human self. So I'm just going to shrink this, move this to the side. So he saw the components of the human self. The components of the human self are skandhas. Okay, that's an A. You can think of skeins that hang together loosely. As yarn. So you can think of having a big ball of yarn. Okay, that's that has all these little snippets of yarn, and you sort of squeeze all together, and so they form an identity. You could have like a skein or something, a ball, but for him, when people die, okay, they in death we leave strands of finite desire, and these strands become realized or come to life in other incarnations. So we leave strands of finite desire that come to life in other incarnations. Basically, bits of you become part of something else, right? And so, if I could go back here, you can see that you have little bits and pieces of these waves here, right? And so when you die, it's the parts of you just sort of disintegrate and could continue with someone else, or I don't know, get burned up or whatever. But you don't stay together as one unit. All right. Now the final little piece I'd like to talk about then is just what happens when finally all these little bits and pieces of desire are burned up. What you get would be enlightenment. Okay, so the enlightened soul is the soul that finally gets to shore. So the enlightened soul is called the arhat, and that's when you finally achieve nirvana, right? So in a way that wave has finally gotten there, okay, and all these little bits and pieces that were part of, different people, right, have finally achieved nirvana. And once this happens, then the enlightened soul, okay, the arhat, ceases to exist. So again, this is similar to Hinduism. When you achieve that final goal of enlightenment and release, um, in a sense, you cease to exist. So of course, the question would be, um, well, at that point, if you cease to exist, don't you want to know that you've gotten there? Um, but again, at this stage, I mean, it's a much higher level of consciousness, of experience. It also works out. So you become one with nirvana. You're self-aware as to some degree, but you're completely caught up in nirvana. And so you are with ultimate being, thinking and feeling and experiencing ultimate consciousness as everything. And so it is a sort of a fulfilling end to this journey. Okay, so those are the elements of Buddhism that I wanted to talk about. We talked about the four passing sites, certain features of this new movement that the Buddha started, and certain features of the religion. Talk about the Four Noble Truths, and then a couple of concepts, nirvana and the human soul or the human self.